Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Great to be here and with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, if you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org, where in our book section you will see a book called Monetary Central Planning in the State by none other than Richard Ebeling. It's a fantastic book dealing with the libertarian perspective on monetary policy. And, well, there it is. Great screenshot there of the book. And, Richard, the reason I'm bringing this up is that, we both have had some fairly good news about this book, that a figure in China decided that he wanted to reprint this book after translating into Chinese. We approved that publication, and that book has recently come out in print in China. So I thought this would, there's a picture, screenshot of the book, and I thought this would give us a nice opportunity to discuss not only how this came about, because let's not forget, this is a communist regime that is running China, and this is a hardcore, pure, uncompromising, principled libertarian organization, which necessarily means not very enthusiastic, to say the least, about communism and socialism. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about how this happened, what you think the ramifications are, and then lead into the libertarian perspective on monetary policy, the gold standard, free market currency, and so forth. So why don't you give us a little bit of background on the book? First of all, how it is that you came to write the book, and then go into tell us a little bit about how this Chinese publication came about.
I will be glad to do so, Comrade Hornberger. Well, actually, the book originated quite a while back when I was serving with great pleasure as the Vice President for Academic Affairs of FFF. I started doing this rather lengthy series that appeared in what was Freedom Daily, is now known as Future of Freedom, the monthly publication, which I then ended up slightly revising and editing to put out as this ebook under the sponsorship of the Future of Freedom Foundation called Monetary Central Planning in the State, which appeared in 2015. And again, if I can sort of say something nice about myself and FFF, for the first 6 months after the book was issued, which was in August 2015, it was among the top 10 in 2 of Amazon's categories for that type of book. And in fact, for part of those 6 months, it actually was in the 1 and 2 position for a while in these 2 ebook categories of theirs. So it was very well received in English. Obviously, the advantage of an ebook is that it's relatively inexpensive, $2–3 on the Amazon site, and can be purchased and downloaded with the click of the mouse, so that we had an audience extending beyond just the United States, but globally. Now, among these readers, I'm very happy to say, were a number of people in mainland China, the People's Republic of China. They had actually been translating some of my articles on a wide variety of themes, had known me in that sense. And then I was approached by a couple of people in China who said that they would be interested in translating the work, and they believed that they had a publisher who was putting out a variety of other books. For example, they had translated Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression, Rothbard's Austrian interpretation of the Hoover years of the Great Depression. And they had asked me to write an introduction, a new special introduction for this Chinese translation, which I did, and they obviously added that to the Chinese version. And after that, and having read my own book on monetary central planning in the state, they asked for permission to translate it into Chinese, which I gave permission for, and obviously FFF did. And then almost a year passed, with a few contacts, and I was informed that the translation was basically done, that they had found the same publisher who had done the Chinese published version of Rothbard's America's Great Depression, Hainan Publishers in Beijing. And that, in fact, this book came out in December in this edition. So this is actually a paperback edition. They very kindly sent me some author copies. I, of course, flipped through it. I have absolutely no idea if they've actually been truthful to me. I can read German. So if it was a German translation, I could at least check it. But they assured me, I in fact had a chance to talk with the translator at a Mont Pelerin Society meeting in the Canary Islands this past October. And very strongly classic liberal and libertarian, living in a communist regime. And very enthusiastic, believing that the themes of the book, and given the degree to which debates over economic policy are being allowed in this in the China of today, that it would have an audience, and in fact it had to go through a censored process. The official Chinese government censors, whatever branch it was that deals with these types of publications, went through it and gave their approval for it to be in print. And to best of my knowledge, since it is a relatively well-known publisher in the People's Republic of China, it is in bookstores in Beijing, Shanghai, Canton, who knows where. So in principle, FFF and I have a readership of 1.3 billion people out there. That's a lot of minds to change. Now, so what is this a book about? And I want to emphasize, for those who do not read Chinese, I know there's probably few and far between there who don't read Chinese in our video land. But if you don't read Chinese, don't despair, because you can go to Amazon and, in fact, for $2 or $3, download this in English. And in fact, if you're a Kindle subscriber, I think it's even less or even free as a Kindle subscriber. But anyway, so what I do in this book is a number of things. Approximately the first half of the book is an exposition and an explanation of the Austrian school theory of money and the business cycle, the origin of money, the nature of money, the importance and the role of a market-based money, the nature of both of central banking and how government management of the money supply sets in motion distortions of interest rates, imbalances between savings and investment, misdirections of capital and labor, all of which lead to the boom and bust cycle of inflation and then a recession. I then contrast that with the Keynesian and the monetarist alternative views of inflations and recessions. I particularly do a detailed critique of the Keynesian argument in the context of the combative and competing Austrian and Keynesian interpretations of the causes and the cures for the Great Depression of the 1930s, because that's where these battle lines first drawn. And then the second half of the book is devoted to well, what type of monetary system should exist in a free society, and one that creates the greatest opportunity for stability, growth, as well as freedom, and to either minimize or eliminate the likelihood of these inflationary boom and bust cycles. And so in this, I explain the rationales, reasoning, and workings of the central banking system. And then I contrast that with the nature, workings, and competitive benefits of a private free banking system, drawing upon the writings of a number of leading competitive free banking authors who have specialized in this. Lawrence H. White, George Selgin, Kevin Dowd in Great Britain, all of whom who have done yeoman's work. So I claim no originality in this other than to synthesize and bring together and present a sort of a full exposition of the case for private competitive free banking, drawing upon their path-breaking works of earlier years and showing the superiority of the private competitive banking system compared to any rationale or justification or historical experience of government-instituted central banking. I believe that these two parts of the book present a fairly detailed, comprehensive, and I would like to pursue case for freedom in money, freedom in banking, and the particular nuance of the Austrian insights and twist on all of this.
Okay, well, going back to the China aspect of this story, I mean, here you have a book called Monetary Central Planning. And central planning is obviously a central feature of the socialist system. It involves a paradigm, a system, in which government is planning a particular economic activity, some endeavor, or educational activity, like public schooling is central planning. And you're presenting a real critique of this paradigm of central planning. And obviously, there is a central bank in China under the communist regime. This would be really an inherent part of any socialist system, that they would control the monetary system. That way they can plunder people at will, they can loot people at will. They have control over people's money.
Yes.
And here you are criticizing it. So what do you make of that? That here this communist regime, the censors have approved this particular book.
Well, I think we have to appreciate the fact that China is in a peculiar state of flux. They have a official communist monopoly government. The current president, President Xi, is attempting to consolidate central authority back again after seemingly greater diffusion of opinions and attitudes and actions by people, to assure that communist control is not undermined. At the same time, and seemingly to continue now, there is allowed a rather wide latitude and degree of arguments and debates over economic policy, the nature of the economic institutions, all in the setting of not directly challenging the legitimacy of the specific communist government in China. Now, my book doesn't do that. It was written in a context in which I don't talk about China. I'm talking about two or three competing schools of economic thought: the Austrians, the Keynesians, and somewhat the monetarists. I'm comparing two institutional arrangements, drawing upon the writings and arguments mostly of economists in, quote, the West, and explaining in sort of a template generic sense the nature of what causes booms and busts, why, and why one institutional setting would likely diminish the likelihood of the severity of them, as well as giving individuals in the society as a whole more individual latitude and liberty to make their own decisions as consumers, producers, savers, and investors for the general prosperity as well as the freedom of the society. And seemingly, in that context of the general case of institutional alternatives and theoretical understandings of how the real world works, the system in China is sufficiently still open and tolerant that a book like this can get a reading. Now, what conclusions someone reaches and might want to then propose as specific policy or institutional changes in China itself, that is not the task I assign myself, though I should say that obviously in talking about these issues, the role of prices, the nature of competition, the limits of central banking, and so on, inevitably in that discussion is the more generic explanation as to why central planning inherently has fundamental flaws, of which monetary central planning, government monopoly control and ownership of the medium of exchange is just a particular example. But seemingly, in all that's going on in China, they have been opened sufficiently to allow these types of out of the main Chinese government mainstream perspectives to be allowed to be publicized and to be debated and read. And I'm happy about it.
Yeah, I think it's the most likely explanation. I think that if you had written the book in the context of analyzing the Chinese monetary system and criticizing what the regime had been doing with this system, I think it might have been much more problematic to get it published. But because it deals with the American system or the British system and talks in terms generally of this paradigm, they see it much less threatening. I had an example of this in Cuba. I visited Cuba, as you know, many years ago, and you could feel the tyranny, and it was made very clear that if you criticize the communist regime, this was a felony. This is a very serious offense. And so I had gotten appointments with various foundations at the University of Havana to interview them about the Cuban socialist system, as well as the effects of the U.S. embargo. And all of the departments that I met with the exception of one, just took the standard line that socialism in Cuba was a great success, that the embargo was the cause of the problems, and that the reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union was that they hadn't followed the correct model. But I encountered one that was totally different. And these were mostly young people in their 30s or so, a group of maybe about 15 that were as libertarian as you and me. I mean, it was just amazing. And all of a sudden we started communicating in a very direct fashion because we were on the same wavelength, and it wasn't this propaganda that the other departments had been mouthing off to me. And so I went to one of the guys' houses, and he shows me his library, and there's Mises and Hayek and Friedman on the shelves. I mean, I was just stunned. Then we went out to dinner discussing libertarianism and so forth. And so I asked him, I said, how do you get away with this? I don't understand. And his explanation was that as long as, because remember, everybody works for the state. And these people, they work for the state. So the state has this total power over them. If they don't like what they're reading, they don't even need to put them in jail. All they have to do is fire them. There's no jobs in the private sector. Everything's owned by the government, to the tune of about 99%. So he explained to me that as long as they couch their arguments in terms of how to better the revolution, improve the revolution, everything's fine. You just can't challenge the fundamental premises of the socialist system or the Cuban Revolution. So I found that very interesting. Now that we had great interactions and so forth. I don't know what ends up happening to them, but my hunch is that it's pretty much similar in China. As long as you're not threatening the existence or challenging the existence of the regime, that they let you get away with things like this.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I teach now at the Citadel, as I think viewers know, here in South Carolina. But before I came here, I was teaching at Northwood University in Midland, Michigan. And Northwood is a private, business-oriented university, and they have a sister relationship with a couple of universities in China. And twice, Northwood sent me to China to give a series of lectures at one of them, located in a city called Wuxi. It's about an hour and a half drive west of Shanghai. Basically, I was teaching a course, an accelerated, concentrated version of a course that I was teaching at Northwood University called The Fundamentals of American Free Enterprise. Now, you couldn't use the word American, but you talked about the fundamentals of free enterprise. And that was, other than changing some examples and never realizing that you're a guest in someone else's house, so you are tactful and polite to your host, particularly in a situation like a country like China. I talked about private property, the meaning and relevance of individual liberty both as an end in itself, as well as a means to an end for people to be able to freely interact to benefit from what each could do for the other in the free exchange of the marketplace in a competitive system of division of labor. The nature of prices and why prices needed to be free. Hayek's sense of a communication device by which people coordinate what they're doing when they're separated by time and space. And there was no problem with that, as long as clearly you did not say, and therefore the current political system should be replaced. As long as one did not do that, opportunity and the actual interest of students to hear these types of arguments. And of course, you never know what idea a young person attending lectures like that takes in and sticks with them and may influence their views and their actions at some point in the future. I can say is that the Chinese students that I had the opportunity to meet in that context were extremely interested in wanting to know about how the system in the United States worked, how it operated, what made it prosperous, and what made Americans view themselves as free without ever raising the issue of what freedom means in China as part of that sort of corridor of legitimate debate. But it was the same thing I think that you saw in Cuba. As long as you didn't say anything or propose anything that challenged the legitimacy and the institutional structures of the prevailing regime, a lot could be said without getting someone into.
Yeah, as a matter of fact.
And Jacob, if I can just add one thing, you're saying, here are books by Mises and Hayek and Friedman in this guy's house. Keep in mind, this publishing house that has put out my book in Chinese, this and another publishing house have translated into Chinese books by Mises, by Hayek, by Menger, by Bombavark, all the core works by what are considered the leading members of the Austrian school. I believe they have a translation of Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, though I'm not sure about that. And certainly Mises' Human Action. I think his book on socialism, Money and Credit, Hayek's works on monetary theory, so that the interested person actually has access to a wide variety of literature that attempts to explain to them the role, meaning, and importance of liberty in the free society in the broadest of these senses.
That's amazing. Yeah, you're right that when this foundation I was referring to in Cuba invited me to one of their meetings, and we were standing around a big conference sitting around a big conference table, maybe about 15 people or so, members of this particular foundation, and they were proceeding with their meeting and introducing themselves, and then they called on me and said, would you like to say some things? They told the audience who I was and so forth. And so I said, well, I would not presume to know enough about your system to talk about it, but I do know about my system, and I can talk about it. That we have a system where the government controls education, and it's an absolute disaster. The government should have no role. The U.S. government, the local government should have no role in education. We libertarians believe in the United States that there should be a free market in education. And so you could see the smiles on their faces because they knew what I was doing. I was criticizing their system by pointing to the socialist structures that the United States has adopted over the last 100 years. From there I went to monetary central planning in the state, which of course is a socialist construct, Social Security, health care. So I was criticizing the entire socialist paradigm by criticizing the socialism in the United States. Let's talk a little bit about the thesis of the book. You talk about monetary central planning. That's what the Fed does, the Federal Reserve. Obviously, the United States didn't always have what we call a central bank. There was the central bank didn't come into existence till 1913, so you had 100 years, more than 100 years, with no central bank. You had what was called a gold standard, which was really a gold coin standard, silver coin standard. That was the official money of the United States. The bills and notes that were circulating were viewed as debt instruments, not real money. They were promises to pay money. And so it was a very unique system compared to all the systems in history. It was a very renowned system, very honest system. That when it said, 1 ounce of gold in that gold coin, there was only 1 ounce. The government wasn't trying to cheat people, and it was really one of the reasons for the tremendous outburst in economic prosperity in the 19th century in the United States. And then that all gets replaced, Richard, with this central planning vehicle that's using paper money. Gold is confiscated, nationalized, without even the semblance of a constitutional amendment. This was during the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. So they reject the system that the Constitution had established, a gold coin standard. They resort to a paper money standard with monetary central planning, which is a socialist construct. So you end up with this constant chaos and crisis in the monetary sphere, not to mention the continual debasement of the paper money that's been taking place for the last more than 100 years, where the value of people's money is just plummeted compared to where it started out in 1913. And that's because the government continues inflates this money to pay for its ever-increasing expenditures to fund the welfare warfare state way of life, which also came into existence in the 30s and 40s. So it really is a totally different kind of monetary system than what was envisioned by the founding fathers, right?
Absolutely. One has to be fair to the historical record. The problem is that while the United States did have a gold-backed currency for a good part of the 19th century, the problem is that the system was never really a laissez-faire free system. The notorious era of, quote, free banking of the 1830s and 40s and part of the 50s is known as wildcat banking. And it has a bad reputation, not because private competitive banking per se was a problem, but what you had these banks chartered at the state level. And a lot of times, the bank owners, the managers, would be in cahoots with the members of the state legislature. Special loans, special privileges. They would operate beyond any reasonable bound of financial conservatism in terms of fractional reserve of outstanding loans, and as a consequence, the banks would get in financial trouble. And rather than tough love and sort of learning your lesson from bad mistakes, the state legislatures would allow banks to suspend meeting their gold obligations, or they would give special deals to the banks, or not prosecute bank managers who would disappear sometimes with the funds. So it wasn't a pure laissez-faire banking system. But it is true that banks were private. They issued their own personal notes. I know that when I lived in Michigan, my wife and I would go to antique stores. To be honest, some of them were more than just glorified junk stores, but, quote, antique stores. And they would often have for sale banknotes from private banks in Michigan, Ohio, or Indiana from the 19th century. And most of these banks, in spite of the sensational instances, such as often criticized about that wildcat banking era, most banks operated honestly, legitimately, were interested in maintaining their brand name. A major part of this, Jacob, if I can just explain this, is that you see, communications did not have the ease or instantaneousness that we take for granted today. So let us suppose that you were banking with a bank, or you had a customer who banked with a bank, and you either were carrying your own bank's notes and being one of their depositors, or you were asked to take notes in exchange from a customer who banked with some bank. Well, how do you know that the notes are going to be accepted in trade? How do you know they'll be accepted at face value? Oh, I'll take that note, but I'm not sure about the bank you're banking with so only at a 10% face value, so 90 cents on the dollar. So these were the checks and balances. Banks wanted to have customers, both depositors and business, for borrowers. They had to maintain a certain brand name reputation and deposit and gold, silver reliability. So most of these banks did their job. They competitively, you could pick to be in Bank X or Bank Y. Bank X, if it overextended, could have a run. That shake the confidence. They had to get their affairs in order, or all the customers would go to Bank Z. And so for most of this time, with all the imperfections, it wasn't like a pure, idealistic system. It operated very effectively without the government managing, controlling, monopolizing, and manipulating. The great change in this actually occurred because of the American Civil War. And again, both in the North and the South, both the Union government and the Confederate governments resorted to paper money inflations to finance their war expenditures. So by historical standards, both the North and the South had dramatic price inflations. But in the North, since Lincoln's government could not generate the tax revenues to cover all of their expenses, they started chartering national banks that would have certain special privileges. But you had to accept government bonds as part of your capital to be licensed, if you will, by the federal government. And they issued greenbacks, that's where the name comes from, in the form of notes to make loans to Lincoln's government. And that's where the word bucks come from. $3, $5, because on the back would be a male deer, so it would be bucks. So greenbacks and bucks. But anyway, so this national bank system was set up to cultivate the funding of the Union side of the war. And then the war ends. But these banks have to have government bonds as capital to operate. Now, beginning in the 1870s, I know I'm giving more history than maybe I should, but this needs to be understood. The federal government is paying off its debt. It's collecting more in taxes than it's spending. It's having a budget surplus. And slowly but surely, it's paying off the debt. Now, how did it pay off the debt? It paid in these greenbacks and reclaimed its IOUs, the government bonds. So the problem is the greenbacks are going out of circulation. There's a smaller capital base of these government bonds for these banks to operate on, which they're mandated to under the national bank rules for the most part. And so you have this crazy monetary and banking system that the federal government set up for its own purposes and then is strangling as it's trying to pay off its debt. And all of the instabilities and problems in the 1880s and 1890s with the financial markets had a lot to do with this peculiar and perverse banking system that the government set up. Now, what happens is that rather than saying it's all a mistake, let's get government out of the banking system, let's have private competitive banks, banks will issue their own currency, they'll have to have brand name reputation, reliability among depositors, et cetera, et cetera. In the late 1890s and in the beginning of the 20th century, what happens? All the politicians and many American economists say, you know what? We have all these problems. What we need is an elastic currency, a centrally managed elastic currency that can meet the needs of a growing economy. And look at Europe. There's the Bank of England. There's the Bank of France. There's the Bank of Italy. There's the Reichsbank, the German central bank. Everybody has this. A modern progressive country has this. America has no central bank. That'll take care of all the problems. And that was the rationales, justifications, and the political purposes, because that obviously gave power to certain major banks through the Federal Reserve to have perks and privileges. That's how it all came about, that the legislation was finally passed to establish a central bank through a congressional act in 1913, and the Federal Reserve then opens its doors in early January 1914. But we ended up with a central bank because of a bastardized banking system that began under Lincoln's administration during the Civil War, that basically co-opted and preempted any possible reform and evolution of a real competitive banking system in the United States.
Yeah, it's a classic example of Mises's dictum that one interventionism will inevitably lead to more interventions to fix the problems associated with the original intervention. Let's wrap it up by mentioning Hayek, F.A. Hayek's great essay, The Denationalization of Money, where
Yes.
he essentially says, just separate money in the state, establish a total free market monetary system, and that whatever people choose in the marketplace to use as their medium of exchange, so be it. And there can be competing currencies, and let the market make this decision, that the free market produces and brings into existence the best of everything. Why is America, which was founded on the principles of a free market in most of the endeavors, certainly not all of them, slavery being a classic example, but why shouldn't this country that has this heritage of free markets be relying on a socialist system of monetary central planning?
Yeah, I should mention, since you mentioned Hayek's book, The Denationalization of Money, this was about a 80 or 90 page monograph that he published in 1976, originally by the Institute of Affairs in a long-established free market organization. And he basically, a lot of times it's said that the older you get, the more conservative you become. With Hayek, the older he got, the more radical he became. When he was battling Keynes in the 1930s, he was an advocate of a gold standard, more or less, but a managed government gold standard. And when he wrote his famous treatise, The Constitution of Liberty, which came out in 1960, he again has a chapter on the monetary framework of a free society, and he still believes there needs to be a government-managed central banking system. He wants more cautious, very non-inflationary, but he still believes it's necessary. But then, in 1976, a couple of years after he won the Nobel Prize, he comes out with this saying is that historically there is no way to reform, harness, confine, give institutional restrictions on a central bank. At the end of the day, it's always going to be abused, the currency will be debased, and the potentials of the boom and bust cycle will always be there. And that the only way to do this is to get government out of the banking and monetary creation business. And that monograph then set the stage for the emergence of this free banking school, some of whose major contributors I mentioned, Lawrence White, George Selgin, Kevin Dowd, whose most writings blossomed in the 1980s, 1990s, and then into our century. And this therefore became an entire new field in monetary theory and banking theory after over a century of no one challenging the notion of a central bank, first inspired by this important monograph by Hayek, The Denationalization of Money.
All right, on that excellent note, we got to wrap it up. Thank you, Richard, for the great discussion. If you want to buy a copy of Monetary Central Planning in the State, you can buy it at our website at fff.org or at amazon.com. Come and visit us there. We have articles going back all the way to the 1990, January 1990, Richard's articles, my articles, and along with a lot of other material there that give the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Absolutely, and thank you, viewers and listeners, for sharing a little bit of your time with us.